Are pro-life laws putting women at risk? Is MAGA semi-fascist? And how corrupt is the FBI? We'll discuss all this and more on this edition of The Editors. I'm Rich Lowering. I'm joined as always by the Right Honorable Charles C.W. Cook, Alexandra Zanda Sanctus, and the sage of authenticity, Woods himself, Jim Garrity. You are, of course, listening to a National Review podcast. Our sponsors this episode are the American Federation for Children and the Mad Dogs and Englishmen Bar and Grill in Tampa, Florida. More about them in due course. If for some reason you're not already following us on streaming service, you can find us everywhere from Spotify to iTunes. If you like what you hear here, please consider giving us a glowing 5-star review on iTunes. If you don't like what you hear here, please forget I said anything. So, Charlie, I hate to disappoint our listeners, but actually we are not, as a matter of fact, sponsored this episode by the Mad Dogs and Englishmen Bar and Grill in Tampa, Florida, but that is a fine establishment, an upstanding establishment that you've had to think a lot about the last several days because of a ridiculous lie that is being told by our sister podcast, co-hosted by you and the great Kevin Williamson, called Mad Dogs and Englishmen. Explain.
Yeah, I think the only thing that I can see that is wrong with the Mad Dogs and Englishmen bar, restaurant, and grill in Tampa, Florida is that I don't, in fact, own it, and that it's not, in fact, a podcast. Will Menaker of the formerly relevant Chapo Trap House podcast thought he had me and Kevin dead to rights when he pointed to the $250,000 in PPP loans that we had taken during COVID. Mad Dogs and Englishmen, he said, must be the best funded podcast in the world. Thing is, Mad Dogs and Englishmen is actually not a particularly well-funded podcast. In fact, it doesn't even have any ads on it. It's also not owned by me or Kevin. It's not owned by an Inc. It's not in Tampa, Florida. It doesn't have 29 employees, and it didn't take any PPP loans. So it's difficult to see how much more wrong Will Menaker could be. Clearly, he or someone around him had typed Mad Dogs and Englishmen into the PPP database on ProPublica and discovered that there is a company called Mad Dogs and Englishmen, which is not that surprising, is it? Given that the phrase goes back to Rudyard Kipling, was then picked up in the 20s and 30s, and then was picked up by Joe Cocker, and thought, aha, look, hypocrites. But no, it's a restaurant. It's in Tampa. I haven't been there. I aim to remedy that soon and hopefully drop into Busch Gardens while I'm down there too. Yeah,
absolutely. We should make it a big NR Plus event. So what would it take? What would it be like? What would the world be like if the Mad Dogs and Englishmen podcast actually had 29 employees? Can you imagine?
I mean,
what would you guys do with them?
Well, I'll tell you what, the first thing we would probably do is hire them to remind us to actually record it, which, I mean, the biggest complaint is that we skip weeks, forget weeks, or that we don't keep to a regular schedule. Sometimes it's a Wednesday, often it's not because we travel or whatever. But with 29 people, we could probably, especially if any of them were impressionists, and they could just fill in for me. They know what we're going to say probably ahead of time. I thought you were going to ask what it would be like if Mad Dogs and Englishmen, Kevin on my podcast, actually did have a restaurant. And the funny thing is, it would actually probably be quite like the restaurant in Tampa. I mean, it would be in Florida for a start. Outside of it, there's a big picture of the Beatles, and it says open 8 days a week. They seem to play classic rock. They have good burgers, lots of beers. So, I mean, if I did have a restaurant in Tampa, it might be a bit like that one.
Awesome.
Rich, I would just like to interpose here and say that I do remind Charlie and Kevin to record every Sunday.
I know, but you're outnumbered. I'm saying if we have 29 people doing it, then they might make some headway.
I would happily email you 29 times on Monday morning.
It doesn't work the same. It's just you need pressure from lots of people. A bit like, if you've put up a tweet that is false and you know that it's false, and then, tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people have seen it, and then you just leave it up. No,
Sarah, it sounds like you might have to resort to Twitter to get results, Sarah.
Well,
tweet at Charlie. When are you guys going to record this thing? So, Zan, let's move on to some serious news here, which is the abortion debate, which has not been going well for Republicans. Thing the end of last week, there was this state rep down in South Carolina, a Republican, who said in testimony or a hearing over another abortion restriction bill in South Carolina that he regretted voting for the heartbeat bill because a doctor called him shortly after it went into effect, said there was a 19-year-old pregnant woman who was having a miscarriage, but the baby still had a heartbeat. So the medical facility said, well, usually our standard of care would be we would remove the fetus immediately or give you the option of going home. But now we do not have the option of removing the fetus immediately, and you have to go home and you have to deliver the fetus at home. And the doctor told this rep that there was 50% chance that this woman would lose her uterus, a 10% chance she would die. And this rep said he really regretted voting for the heartbeat bill, and these bills have real consequences, and he didn't realize it. And of course, the left and the media hopped on this. You've had a report in Slate saying that all these health exceptions in these bills require an imminent threat to the life of the mother. You have legal action. Merrick Garland sued Idaho, Texas sued the Biden administration, and the White House spokeswoman said that Texas, there's no protection for the health of the mother. So what's going on here?
Well, I think we should take a step back from the kind of granular stories and keep in mind that I guess it's been 2 months now since Roe v. Wade was overturned, and our debate since then at kind of the national level has been about nothing other than situations in which mothers' lives are at risk or allegedly at risk during pregnancy, and abortion supporters claiming that pro-life laws are going to lead these women to die. Their case has not been that abortion is good. It has not been that abortion should be legal. It has not been that Roe v. Wade was legally correct. Their case has been women are going to be dying. And I think it's very telling that this is the first argument and really the only argument they've gone to in the wake of Roe having been overturned. And the fact of the matter is, I've written a very long and detailed piece about this. The Charlotte Lozier Institute has done a full report looking into this. Every pro-life law on the books has ample medical emergency exemptions for doctors to exercise their best medical judgment in situations where a pregnant woman's life or health is at risk, by which they mean, risk of substantial impairment. They do not mean mental health, which is how, the abortion lobby has gotten away with unlimited abortion now for 50 years. They do not mean mental health, but if a pregnant mother's life is at risk as a result of her pregnancy, she can always get necessary medical treatment. And this is where the abortion lobby is lying in particular, because these types of treatments are not abortions. If a woman has an ectopic pregnancy, which is when the baby, the embryo implants outside the uterus, that kind of treatment for that, removal of that embryo, is not a direct abortion. A direct abortion is when the doctor goes in and for no medical reason whatsoever kills a baby. That is never medically necessary, but it might be medically necessary to treat a woman who's going through a miscarriage. And the distinction that all of these laws include is that there are two patients here, right? The mother and the child. Mm-hmm. And it's never necessary, medically speaking, to target the baby. A lot of the times later in pregnancy, if there's some kind of complication, it's actually safer for the mother and certainly safer for the baby to deliver early. And maybe the baby won't survive, but the doctor can try and care for the baby in that situation and take care of the mother. It's never necessary to kill the baby. And so what the abortion lobby here is doing, what abortion supporters are doing, and I think some of these doctors are in on it and politicians are in on it, is trying to lie essentially about the text of these laws and claim that somehow women's lives are going to be at risk. They're not. If a woman's life is at risk, a doctor is always permitted to treat her as long as he is not pretending that directly killing her baby is part of that treatment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, you've done yeoman's work in this area. So has the Charlotte Lozier Institute, which is just a tremendous outfit. And by and large, not in every single case, but by and large, these laws, they cite the health of the mother, the life of the mother. They do not say it has to be an imminent threat, and they use the phrase "best medical judgment," which is supposed to provide leeway for doctors in the cases where there is a serious complication, and they cite, the risk of a serious physical impairment. And again, going back to South Carolina, losing your uterus is a serious medical impairment. And it seems to me that there was ample warrant in that South Carolina law for this young woman to get miscarriage treatment. She did end up, as far as I understand, she left the medical facility after going there initially, and then did return and get the appropriate miscarriage care. But these laws are pretty clear on this. Again, not all of them, but almost all of them. And one reason for confusion, and John McCormick has been our colleague, writing about this a lot, is the haze of disinformation from the other side, which has an incentive to try to make it seem as though these laws are okay with women suffering serious harm or potentially being on the cusp of death, which isn't true, and just bad advice from attorneys at hospitals and healthcare facilities. So you really need AGs in these states and others just pounding home what the laws actually say to avoid misunderstandings that may harm women and that also are a political disaster for Republicans.
Yeah, I mean, if I could just add one more quick point on that, I think the people spreading that kind of misinformation, if there are doctors out there, if there are women out there, if there are just kind of, citizen observers following this debate, thinking that women can't get emergency medical care in different types of, pregnancy complications, the only people saying that are pro-abortion people. There are no pro-lifers saying women should be left to die, women can't get care. It doesn't matter if women die as long as the baby isn't killed. I mean, no one is saying that. The only people trying to muddy the waters here and pretend that pro-life laws prevent medical treatment for pregnant women are pro-abortion people. So if there are doctors who sincerely think this, or hospital attorneys who are sincerely recommending this, the confusion is not being caused by pro-lifers or the laws. It's being caused by abortion supporters who are making that claim.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, Jim, part of the pattern here, though, I think going back to South Carolina, not to obsess with it, but I paid some attention to it, is I think this Republican who went viral was misinformed about the very law he voted for. And I think that's a major theme here. Republicans rhetorically, Republicans had 50 years to prepare for Roe eventually being overturned. But one of the things that was the very easiest to predict is that they would be scared, confused, and ill-prepared when it actually happened. And sure enough, here we are, when they're running around, either kind of in a really maladroit way, repositioning themselves. Blake Masters has gotten hit on this. He in effect had a pre-Dobbs website that staked out these absolutist positions on abortion that are correct on the merits, but aren't politically defensible, and then totally scrubbed the thing and said, actually, he just wants to, for the moment, ban late-term abortions. So you have that going on. Then you have just some Republicans just running and hiding and hoping this will go away, which it won't do. And then you have some Republicans in some places still wanting to pass or support restrictions without exceptions for rape and incest, which is a total political disaster. So it may well be that the media is exaggerating the extent to which abortion is changing the trajectory of the midterms, but certainly it's Republicans are at the very least on their back foot.
Indeed, Rich. And this, of all the problems that face the Republican Party, it's the self-inflicted ones that are the ones that'll have us tearing our hair out. That look, sometimes events are going to go a certain way. Some candidate you like is going to get caught in some scandal. Life is going to throw some curveballs your way. That's just baked in the cake. But when you see a situation that is as predictable as the overturning of Roe versus Wade, something that the overwhelming majority of Republican candidates and Republican office holders have been saying they want to happen for 2 generations now. And then all of a sudden, as you said, they're either very quiet or they are doubling down on a position that is very unpopular, a total ban with no exceptions, no rape, no incest, nothing like that. For the last couple of years, it's been very popular to blame the failures of Republican candidates and Republican office holders on the consultant class. And it's kind of turned into this very easy scapegoat. Now, look, if you look at the likes of Steve Schmidt and John Weaver, I can understand why you would say, the problem is they listen to these idiot consultants who don't actually believe the values and who look down their noses at red states themselves and are afraid to take any stances and just want to be political weather vanes. Look, I can understand why people feel that way. My experience with Republican consultants covering them for a long time is that they're just like every other human being. You find good ones, you find bad ones, and you find a lot in between. But in a circumstance like this really does look like an indictment of the consultant class, because this is not an issue that's came out of nowhere. This wasn't 9/11. This wasn't the COVID-19 virus. This wasn't just something that, where could this come? Everybody knew. And even if you didn't like, oh, well, there was a really big abortion case before the Supreme Court, you had the Sam Alito draft leak. In other words, everyone had months to oh, this is what it looks like the Supreme Court's going to do. They had months to prepare their statements. They had months to say, this is what I believe. This is why I believe it. This is what I want to do. And this is why my effort to ban late-term abortions, my effort to ban partial birth abortions, my effort to get parental consent for those under 18, unless it's a case of incest, all of these very reasonable restrictions. And for them to say, look, I don't want to suddenly, revert 180 degrees. I don't think my state is ready for this. I want to make it a gradual transition. And this is the step that I feel is appropriate now. How these candidates aren't ready for this is just mind-boggling. And I think it ties into something that's on the cover of the magazine right now, this mentality amongst a whole bunch of Republicans, including ones that I generally like Mitch McConnell. This idea that it's dangerous to run on an agenda because it gives the opposition something to demonize and target. That it's better to just run as the opposition and say, I don't like things that are you unhappy with the way things are going? So am I. Vote for me if you're mad. And look, I understand every opposition party wants to turn the election into a referendum on the party in power. I realize the trepidation that comes with turning it into a choice. But one, if you get elected just being an opposition, you don't really have any mandate. And then two, you end up in a situation like you want to build a positive agenda. You want to build something you're for. And I think this overall reticence, hesitation, we're getting closer to football season. You talk about teams that play scared. A lot of cases, it feels like the Republican Party and its candidates are playing scared.
Mm-hmm. And Charlie, one of the ironies of the focus on miscarriages in this debate is, yes, you do not want women to suffer serious medical harms during a miscarriage, but miscarriages are experienced as a tragedy by the parents involved. And one of the awful things about them, it's a sense of loss that very often you can't really properly grieve. But the moral intuition of all these parents is that there's been a loss of a life. So to have the left and the Democrats focus on miscarriages without making that connection, that this is a fundamental moral intuition shared by embraced by pro-lifers, is kind of perverse.
It should not be too difficult for Republicans to do well on this issue. Yes, there will be headwinds. Yes, there will be lies. Yes, there will be media bias. But the position that is held by the Democratic Party is not only unpopular, it's repugnant and unusual. I've seen some interviews recently in which members of the press have pointed this out, most recently with Tim Ryan in Ohio, who kept trying to use this line that Democrats have hit upon, I trust the woman, which means in practice no restrictions whatsoever. The Democrats don't only have an absurd position on this, which essentially amounts to abortion for any reason through 9 months, but advocates of abortion on demand have talked themselves into some strange positions that most pro-choicers indeed, do not hold, such that there is nothing upsetting or distressing or traumatic about having a miscarriage. Meaningless clump of cells. Republicans, though, are not doing especially well post-ops. They don't have a plan, as Jim pointed out. Many of them are nervous talking about this. And I think this is where Republicans have some responsibility to improve despite the media environment. And they don't seem willing or able to do the easy bits. Now, Alexandra is absolutely right when she says that there are no pro-lifers. None. Especially not in elective politics, who want to see the life of the mother endangered in any circumstance. So why not say it? Why not have a signing ceremony in every state that has passed a pro-life law, whether actively or via a trigger mechanism, for protections for the life of the mother? It's not going to upset pro-lifers. It will put pro-choicers in a difficult position because it will undercut the arguments that they make. And if necessary, pair it with a bill outlawing late-term abortion, partial birth abortion, or abortion up until X number of weeks. The states have differed on this. I think Republicans ought to be forthright about this. They ought to be active in clearing up the law. They ought to make it obvious that this worries them. If there is ambiguity, fix it. Make it difficult for those lies to gain hold. Where there are no ambiguities, repass the same law. And we just saw the Democratic Party do that in their gun control bill with straw purchases, and then announce it. In such cases, as the life of the mother is in danger, you have to structure it carefully, of course, or it will be abused. There is no limitation in this state. I think that one of the problems that the Republican Party has here is that it is now a victim of its own success. It took 50 years to cement an originalist or originalist adjacent majority on the Supreme Court. We now have one. We now have a legal environment in which even the opponents of the originalist wing feel a need, in most cases, to nod to originalism, in which the newest Supreme Court justice appointed by Joe Biden felt the need to call herself an originalist. That is a victory. We now live in a country in which the Supreme Court has decided to stop superintending abortion law. And we live in a country in which an awful lot of states still had on their books the laws that they had to begin with. And so overnight, without lawmakers having to do anything, the question was returned to the states, and the state laws that had applied before Roe came into force. And many Republicans, as well as not knowing what to do, are sitting there thinking, well, great, that was all taken care of for me. Well, yes and no. The smartest thing to do would be to put into law, codify, if you will, everything that Alexandra just said, and make a big fuss about it while you're doing it, so that it is clear what pro-lifers believe and what they don't, and what pro-life laws do and say and what they don't.
So, Zan, last thing on this topic. Do you support the approach that Ramesh has written about and others have endorsed? Let's get congressional Republicans on record with some specific proposal that's high profile, that Republicans around the country who might be confused or not know what to do can point to, can cling to, which is some gestational limit that is far short of what we ultimately would want as pro-lifers, but has public support and lets you get your footing and then shoot at the other side and say, hey, they're the extremists because they don't want any restrictions and want federal funding all the way through 9 months.
I think that would be a great idea. I would totally support that. And I've actually been saying, I don't know if I've written this at National Review necessarily, but what I've been thinking is the first thing Republicans should have been prepared to do is at least try to get a vote on the Born Alive bill as soon after Dobbs as they could. Because for 3 years in a row, Democrats, almost every Democrat in the Senate, voted against a bill that would have just required doctors to treat babies who survived an abortion, who are born alive after an abortion, the same way they treat any other newborn. And Democrats won't vote for that bill. And it's, totally extreme. It's not even an abortion regulation, but they won't vote for it. And I think it highlights the extremism of the other side better than any legislation, even more than the partial birth issue. And that's the way I think the strategy has to be put the other side on defense. And that's why the abortion lobby, I think, has been doing so well so far, because they refuse to talk about anything other than, 0.00 something % of all cases and act as though pro-life laws are somehow harming women, when in fact they're not. And they're the one, their actual policy position is they want abortion available throughout pregnancy for any reason. And they don't want doctors to care for babies who survive abortion after birth the way they'd care for any other newborn. That's their position. And we're not talking about it because they're too busy accusing pro-lifers of wanting women to die. So there has to be some kind of regrouping, something to rally around, to turn the focus back on how extreme the other side is.
Jim Garrity asks a question on this to you. If there's no red wave in November, the role that Dobbs will have played in it, in your view, will have been major, minimal, or non-existent?
Want something
I guess,
between.
I guess there should be a moderate. I should put a moderate
Yeah.
option there, but between major and minimal.
I was just about to say I needed something in
I'm
between.
such an
there.
extremist, Jim. It's just like one extreme or the other with me.
Because look, I think, by the way, if you expand it to say the Dobbs decision and the Republican Party's poor response and poor ability to articulate what it actually wants to do regarding abortion policy, that is a significant chunk. But look, we're seeing gas prices come down some. Biden's had some legislative wins. Democrats are getting more fired up. There are some really subpar Republican candidates out there this cycle. So you add all that up, that's the problem. But yeah, I think the question will be, is the Republican Party ready to campaign in a post-Roe v. Wade world? And so far, it doesn't look like they are.
Charlie Cook.
I think it will be minimal, but that's not to say it will not have an effect.
Zan.
I think it'll be minimal, mainly because the people who it will affect or I guess motivate the most are people who are already going to be voting for Democrats and we're almost certainly going to be turning out. So I don't think it'll make much of a difference, practically speaking.
So after adding the moderate option, I'm going to slice it even thinner and say I think probably somewhere between minimal and moderate. It's going to have more of an effect than I thought prior to in the immediate aftermath of Dobbs. But if there's truly no Republican wave, there'll be larger factors at work. With that, let's hear from our sponsor this episode, the American Federation for Children.
Hey everybody, this is Corey DeAngelis from the American Federation for Children. It is about time we fund students, not systems. After all, education funding is supposed to be meant for educating children, not for propping up and protecting a particular institution. The good news is that the wind is at our backs. We're winning on the front of education freedom, and we're going to free every single family from the clutches of the teachers' unions once and for all. But we need your help in this fight, and you could do so at edfreedom.com. That's edfreedom.com. Thank you guys so much. This is Corey DeAngelis from the American Federation for Children.
So, Charlie, Joe Biden was at it last week, came up with a killer line. Apparently, he's very proud of. I've heard from reporters, which is he called the MAGA movement semi-fascist. So is he in any sense correct? Is the MAGA movement sort of, kind of, maybe a little bit fascist?
Just think of the remarkable chutzpah that it takes to issue an executive order that usurps the power of Congress, that yourself is illegal, that the Speaker of the House has said is illegal, that the Department of Education has said is illegal, on the strength of an OLC memo that would in other circumstances get lawyers disbarred, in the name of a crisis that you have been schizophrenic on for 6 months. Imagine the chutzpah it takes to do that, and then the next day call your opponent semi-fascist, and to plan a speech in which you talk about battles for the soul of the nation. I'm sorry, I have some well-trodden criticisms of Donald Trump and of many who think like him. And I have well-trodden criticisms of some on the right as well, what I would call the illiberal or post-liberal right. But this is the biggest whatabout I have seen in recent memory. Joe Biden is basing his critique on things that happened a long time ago. And he's doing it to distract from the fact that right now, he is once again violating his oath of office. This is a pattern with this president. First, he says he can't do something. His team says he can't do something. Prominent legislators say he can't do something. Then he does it. He's now done this with student loans. He's now done this with the eviction moratorium. He's now done this with the vaccine mandate on large employers. I don't think that one has to like the other side. I don't think that one has to defend the other side in order to see that this is not the pressing question in American politics right now. And on the merits of it, I certainly wouldn't have used those words. I think prepending semi to the word fascist makes it laughable in the same way as prepending social to the word justice makes it laughable. But I don't want to be distracted by this. I am, in a sense, rejecting your question. I think that we have had enough of this one-sided application of principle. I certainly have. I'm tired of it. I'm tired of watching Joe Biden do all the things he criticized Trump for. I'm tired of relentless talk of authoritarianism from a man who has relentlessly violated his oath of office. This to me is hand waving. It's what happens when you believe that the media will back you at every juncture, and you have confused America for Twitter.
So, Zan, it is extremely irksome that it's not true in this case of the student loan forgiveness that no Democrats have said that he doesn't have the legal authority. Some of the Democrats in tough Senate races have alluded to that. There's this Third Way centrist think tank who said he doesn't have the authority. But like Obama on DACA, I don't think anyone said it. Like no one said it. And certainly in this case, even though some Democrats have said it, it hasn't had the thermonuclear effect. Obviously, if Trump had done something like this, the sole debate would be whether he had the legal authority and what had happened to our Constitution and why was he shredding it by doing this. And that hasn't been the overwhelming issue here at all.
Well, I think there's two things going on here. One is that Democrats have, you mentioned DACA. I think that's a great point to raise because they've been doing things like this for a long time, and it wasn't always as egregious. I think this is probably the most egregious example that we've seen, but they've been trying to pull off things through the executive branch that they don't have the authority for quite some time. And so I think people are just kind of, we're like the proverbial frog in the pot where the water just gets a little bit warmer and a little bit warmer and a little bit warmer before you notice you're cooked, right? Instead of being dropped into boiling water, they're just slowly customizing everybody to, doing more and more flagrant abuses of executive authority to do what they want, and hoping that if they get away with it, they can do something just a little bit more egregious or a little bit more tenuous the next time, and no one will even notice. And I think that's basically what's happening. But secondly, this is another example of what we've seen lately from Democrats, and I don't know for how long now, where they actually don't care. They don't feel like they have to give a justification anymore. Their justification is, this thing is good. I think it's good. This group of people thinks it's good, or this group of people wants it, or I want it, or, whatever reason they come up with. And therefore, I'm going to do it. They don't care about the Constitution. They don't even care about trying to claim that it's constitutional or that they have the authority for it. They've done it with bills. They've done it with Biden's executive orders. They simply do not care. And they're becoming, because they get away with it more and more, I think they're becoming more brazen about just saying, well, this is a good policy. I think it's good to forgive these loans, or these people are suffering, or whatever their justification is. It's not at all a constitutional justification, but they just don't care. As long as they think their goal, their end is acceptable, the means are not a problem for them. They'll use whatever means they have to actually get it done.
So, Jim, there was a good TikTok in the Washington Post, this kind of reporting that the Post excels at, on how Biden decided to go down this route. And, it's on the one hand, it's illuminating. On the other, it's not at all surprising on what we would have guessed. He was very reluctant to do this, skeptical he had the authority, a lot of people around him, and he himself, the politics of this aren't very good. Most people don't have college degrees in this country, but the left just relentlessly works him. Elizabeth Warren, has seated staffers throughout the administration in key positions regarding this kind of decision. The Congressional Black Caucus says you have to do this. Chuck Schumer says you have to do this, and they just wear him down. They get him to 10,000. He says, I'm not doing 50, because he's such a moderate. He's not doing 50, but he'll do 10. And the Congressional Black Caucus says, well, that's racist because you have people of color disproportionately carrying student debt. And then they come up with this further policy where they're going to go to 20 with people who have received Pell Grants. And once again, Biden has been steamrolled by the left.
So first of all, listeners, I should begin by explaining that when Rich uses the term a TikTok, he means the kind of story that offers the sequence of events day by day, demonstrating changes and developments. He doesn't mean a social media TikTok, nor a story by Taylor Lorenz that requires a million corrections down the road. Yes, and by the way, doesn't it feel great to know that Biden is, when given the choice, say Yellen is warning that this is going to be inflationary. We're throwing a lot of money into the economy. Instead, in fact, even when Jill Biden is worried about this, that when push comes to shove, Joe Biden chooses to listen to Kamala Harris. We are in the very best of hands, America. On the general question of Biden using this term semi-fascist, actually, I'm going to stop here for a second. What's a semi-fascist? I think it's kind of like being a little bit pregnant. Either you are or you aren't. The fascists were not really known for being wishy-washy. Well, we're going to goose step around and oppress people on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, but Tuesdays and Thursdays.
Not particularly high goose steps. Just
they do it with one leg. They hop. It's a goose hop.
They're very they're fascists who are hard to motivate. But I want to take you all back to January 20th, 2021, when Joe Biden had just taken the oath of office to become president, and then laid out his vision of how he wanted to serve the country as president. My whole soul is in it. My whole soul is in it. Today, on this January day, my whole soul is in this, bringing America together, uniting our people and uniting our nation. I ask every American to join me in this cause, uniting to fight the common foes we face: anger, resentment, hatred, extremism, lawlessness, violence. With unity, we can do great things, important things. We can see each other not as adversaries, but as neighbors, by the way, deliberately echoing Abraham Lincoln. We can treat each other with dignity and respect. We can join forces, stop the shouting, and lower the temperature. For without unity, there is no peace, only bitterness and fury. So get on board, you fascists. I think if you're not standing with me, you're standing with Jefferson Davis. I way back in the Obama years, I said every statement from Barack Obama comes with an expiration date. I think in the moment, Joe Biden, to the extent he's aware of what he's doing and saying, he believes what he's saying, but just the circumstances change pretty quickly. And then he doesn't see any contradiction between calling for unity and lowering the tone and treating each other with dignity and respect, and then turning around and calling up to nearly half the country semi-fascist. That he doesn't see how there's any type of a contradiction there whatsoever. You can't unite the country when you run around insisting that your opponents are not merely a mistake. By the way, I talked about this in the context of the comment from Charlie Crist and New York Governor Kathy Hochul, this general sense of it's not just my opponent who's bad. Those who support my opponent are bad. This is a transition. This is a very basket of deplorables here, because it used to be, you're good people. Don't get hoodwinked by this guy. This guy's not going to be able to deliver on all those promises. There was kind of this, my opponent is bad, but you are not bad. You're just being misled. And now this is transition to, you're supporting my opponent. You are a bad person. You have hate in your heart.
That's interesting. Have you written that, Jim?
I have. Good to see you read it, Rich.
I knew it was a slightly risky question to ask.
It doesn't even.
I'm glad you did, because it's a great point.
Assume that the people that he's talking about, whether it's a small group or a big group or everyone who isn't a Democrat, is indeed a semi-fascist. Let's stipulate that for the sake of argument. They're all semi-fascist. Semi-fascist means something, and Joe Biden has them dead to rights. So what is the ergo? Is it, I will behave illegally? I mean, this is the thing I don't get. So I could certainly see, in theory, some sort of emergency declaration that a president might have to indulge in if indeed his opponents were semi-fascist. Let's say Lincoln suspending habeas corpus. Let's say some of the excesses that we see in wartime. Let's say the use of executive power to bolster elections, or the freedom of the press, or minority rights in some way. What has college debt got to do with this? And it is a complete non sequitur. His behavior is irrational. His arguments make no sense. And he does this from time to time. He just sort of returns to this well, apropos of nothing. What has happened in the last week that occasioned that comment? What has happened in the last month to warrant this soul of the nation talk? What?
I'll tell you what. Midterms coming up, and focus on Trump is to their advantage. And, I think a basketball.
But what has Trump done?
Trump did say
his house searched.
Yeah, Trump did say we should rerun the 2020 election.
I mean, again, let's assume that I'm wrong about the search. Let's assume that it's justified, that under any other circumstance that someone else would have had their home searched, given a similar records law. Let's assume Trump's guilty of violating the Presidential Records Act, and that he should be prosecuted by the Justice Department, and that he should go to jail. What has that got to do with fascism? This is an erratic administration that just sort of decides things willy-nilly, that passes a fake Inflation Reduction Act, and then the next week steps all over it by spending more money without congressional approval than it's supposedly saved, and causing inflation into the bargain. That doesn't have a coherent view of its role or of its opponent. It's just baffling to me the way that Biden behaves.
Really quickly, because we got to move on. So, have you changed your view at all? I mean, you were always, let's see the facts, but skeptical. That's still your basic posture, even with what we've learned. This letter from the archivist outlining all the steps they'd gone through trying to negotiate with Trump on this. I'm still basically skeptical of the raid. Want to learn more. And will not believe any media reports about these documents. I basically want a top secret clearance. I want to go to a SCIF. I want to review them myself before I'll believe anything that's said about them. But I think there are two sides of the coin here. Like, this raid was very bad, shouldn't have happened. So the authorities should have exercised prudence in approving it, and really should have been a last resort. But on the other side, you would hope Trump would have also done his share to cooperate and not get us to this point. And there's been a lot of more evidence that he was falling down on his side of the bargain.
Well, of course he was falling down on his side of the bargain. He's Donald Trump. But I take that as a given, not just because he's Donald Trump, but because you should assume when evaluating the behavior of government or prosecutors or investigators or FBI agents that the person in question might be a bad egg. Right. I mean, I've said before, I'm a squisher on criminal justice. That doesn't mean that I think that everyone's innocent. It means that I think that the government should be restrained and careful, and it should be just as restrained and careful when it's dealing with a serial killer as it should with anyone else. So, making that case is in no way to suggest that Trump isn't behaving badly. I'm sure he is, and he may well be guilty of this violation, but I haven't changed my view yet, because I think that the same question obtains now as did then, and that is, was this necessary? Was this justified? Was it truly a last resort? And was it conducted properly? And it doesn't seem to be. It seems to have been almost freelanced, and it seems still to be out of kilter with the way in which similar cases are dealt with. That said, if there is something in there that is genuinely a risk, sure. I will reserve judgment, but no, I'm not yet convinced.
It is notable that the Washington Post explosive initial reporting that they're looking for documents related to nuclear weapons is like totally totally disappeared. I mean, the Post has done big stories on this, further TikToks, Jim, and nuclear weapons. That phrase is nowhere to be found in any of the stories. So Zan, exit question to you, echoing the exit question from the first segment. If there is no red wave in November, how big a role will the prominence that Donald Trump has now taken in the midterms play? Major, moderate, minimal, non-existent.
Do you mean in making it not a red wave?
Yeah.
I would say moderate. I think that I'm not sure that he's trying to do it himself. He hasn't changed much of anything about his behavior, but I think Democrats have successfully made him more of a topic of conversation than he needs to be, and it's helping them.
Jim Garrity.
Major, particularly if you expand it to the idea that a whole bunch of these under subpar Republican Senate candidates were nominated because they were endorsed by Donald Trump. I think Mehmet Oz comes to mind. Maybe Herschel Walker would have been a popular enough former athlete that he would have won either way. Blake Masters, I think J.D. Vance is going to be okay, but clearly he's running well beyond Mike DeWine. These are all races that are either Republican leaning or Republicans had won those states in the not too distant past. And look, I think in picking amateur candidates that Trump liked best because they were celebrities like him is backfiring in a lot of these places.
So, Jim, where are you on Pennsylvania Senate? By the way, have you put that away for Fetterman? Or I know you're not an Oz fan. Certainly, Oz hasn't looked great, but there have been polls that look better lately.
They have, and I'd rather see that than Fetterman ahead by monster margins. I suppose there's probably some Republicans coming home. I looked at the numbers and found out that roughly a quarter of Pennsylvania Republicans do not feel favorable towards Mehmet Oz, but are still voting for him anyway. Mm-hmm. I think in the end, a big part of the problem is that Mehmet Oz, he never was a Trump guy, or he never seemed authentically populist or nationalist, or really all that conservative. So there wasn't any branch of the party.
Really political in any way.
Yeah, he was unless you like, carrots will prevent cancer, kind of crazy stuff. His audience, I don't know if his audience was ever that big in Pennsylvania, but it certainly doesn't seem like they're, those who watch a lot of daytime TV are gravitating to him. But you're seeing Republicans come home, so to speak, hold their noses, vote for him. I think it's just every bit as toxic amongst independents, which is tough. And yeah, Fetterman's a deeply flawed candidate. I mean, can you imagine Pat Toomey running against this guy? Can you imagine, I think McCormick would have been stronger. I'm still very skeptical. The polls are closing a little bit. I think it won't be quite the blowout that it looked like earlier in the summer, but it's very hard to argue that that's because, Oz has done anything special.
Yeah, I think Oz is still very much in the game. And speaking of carrots, by the way, I think carrot sticks might be among the best healthy snacks. I just love the snap of a good carrot stick. With that, Charlie, exit question to you.
Where we serve a lot of carrot sticks is at the Mad Dogs and Englishmen Bar and Grill. Tampa,
with the buffalo
wings.
Yes,
with the wings, almost the carrot sticks are almost as good as the wings.
Right, nearly.
So Trump, if this red wave doesn't happen, Trump major, moderate, minimal, non-existent, Charlie?
Oh, I think you have a moderate blame.
Yeah, I'll go with moderate as well. And, this search is just, the politics of it are so good for the Democrats because it makes Trump more of an issue, which hurts Republicans, certainly at the margins in the midterms. It makes Trump more likely to be the Republican nominee in 2024, which I think Democrats, certainly Joe Biden, welcomes. And it probably would hurt at the margins Trump in a general election. So it's really a trifecta. So let me mention that we got a great event on the broader National Review calendar coming up here. Buckley dinner out in California in honor of the great Larry Kudlow, who's receiving the Buckley Prize in Political Thought. Larry is a longtime friend of National Review, was employed for a period by National Review back in the 1990s. We all know and love him. Longtime CNBC host, then Trump economic advisor, and now a star on Fox Business. These dinners are they are fantastic. They are memorable events. They are elegant events. They are warm events. They're just really terrific. So time is running out, but check out nrinstitute.com for more information. We would love to see you there helping us honor the great Larry Kudlow. So with that, Zan, we had this explosive podcast with Mark Zuckerberg, a guest with Joe Rogan. And Zuckerberg explains, I mean, it's almost mind blowing just to say it, that they suppressed the Hunter Biden laptop story prior to the election, not as as completely as Twitter did. I mean, you just couldn't actively couldn't share a link on Twitter, but they suppressed the story in their news feed, according to Zuckerberg, because they got a warning from the FBI that there's a lot of Russian disinformation out there, just like in 2016. You got to be really, really careful. And he said in the answer to the podcast that he didn't remember the FBI specifically mentioning the Hunter Biden laptop story, but at the very least, the Hunter Biden laptop story had the hallmarks of what the FBI was talking about. So here you have the FBI, at least indirectly, leading a major social media company with huge news reach to suppress a legitimate news story. What do you make of it?
Well, I don't find it all that surprising. I don't think many people do. And I think this is why you saw the reaction from the right to the FBI going to Mar-a-Lago and, the warrant not being public and all that. People reacted the way they did because the FBI does things like this. And of course, there's separate cases. It's not that one justifies the other necessarily, but the FBI has been known to operate on behalf, essentially, of politicians and on behalf of Democrats, and weaponize its power against Republicans, or to use its influence against Republicans. And I would think Facebook was already inclined to be the kind of social media company that would want to suppress the Hunter Biden story. Who knows? Maybe they would have ended up flagging it as disinformation for their own reasons, political or otherwise, without the FBI saying anything. So I think it's less about the fact that the story ended up actually being suppressed, which is notable enough, and more about the fact that the FBI was going around telling social media companies anything, as if it's the job of Facebook or Twitter to help the FBI, try to figure out whether Russia's posting stories. That's not, in my mind, what social media companies exist to do. They shouldn't be cooperating with agencies of the federal government to suppress information. They shouldn't really be doing much of anything other than just moderating a social media site according to fair rules, which none of them do. And so I think this story is a lot more revealing about the FBI and about Democrats than it is about, Zuckerberg or Facebook.
So, Jim, we also have this story of this FBI official who was accused of bias in the investigation of the Hunter Biden matter, and more broadly by various whistleblowers in a letter cited by, they were cited in a letter by Chuck Grassley. You have him retiring and escorted from the building, which apparently is a standard procedure. But there's some suggestion here that this guy is out just because he was called out for political bias. And it's another suggestion that the FBI might have been putting its thumb on the scale on the 2020 election. Where are you on the FBI at the moment?
Well, before we jump into the case of Timothy Thibault, the agent who was handling the Hunter Biden probe, regarding the FBI talking to Facebook, there were two interesting reactions after Zuckerberg made that comment on the Joe Rogan show. The first was the FBI's, issued a statement saying, look, all we did was notify them about foreign threat indicators. They're very quick to say, look, we can't, we will continue to work closely with, private sector partners to keep the public informed of potential threats, but the FBI cannot ask or direct companies to take action on information received. Now, when the FBI says, hey, be careful of that foreign disinformation there, you can very strongly argue that the threat or the implication of legal consequences from the FBI is implied. But nonetheless, for what they're saying, they said they did not tell Facebook to take it down or ask that they take it down, for what it's worth. The other thing is there was a comment from the PR, the PR office of Meta, or what we used to call, what Facebook is now today, saying, quote, as we've said, nothing about the Hunter Biden laptop story is new. The FBI shared general warnings about foreign interference, nothing specific about Hunter Biden. which doesn't quite line up with what Zuckerberg said on the Rogan show. So I don't know if Zuckerberg is going rogue or he's saying things that other parts of the company don't want him to say, or what exactly the story is, but I think it's a little bit murkier.
Yeah, no, that's fair. But Zuckerberg was basically making the connection between the FBI and not under pressure. He volunteered it.
Yeah, which, by the way, I think people might argue is worse. If you got two big burly FBI agents at your door saying, "Hey, we don't like this. This post looks like foreign disinformation to us." Maybe you could say, "Look, I was intimidated. I didn't want the FBI getting in my business." Or you could say, "No, the government said we should. This is bad, and I quickly took it down." As for, I would love to believe. We've heard for a long time this idea that rank and file FBI agents are frustrated with management. They feel like management, going back to the Jim Comey days, had gotten too politicized, that it was protecting certain people, that it was, certain Democrats, Hillary Clinton, et cetera, that the management had become a bunch of political actors and, their thumb was on the scale. And, and we've been hearing this, like I said, since, 2016. It's very tough to say, and we saw Peter Strzok, these arguments have gone on for a long time. If it really is the case that somebody is looking at this and saying, holy smokes, we've had somebody at the FBI who's been de facto protecting Hunter Biden and the Biden family for all these years and has been trying to cover up things that they do that are immoral or wrong or corrupt or break the law, and they've been suppressing. Great. I'd like to hear it from somebody besides Chuck Grassley. I'd like to hear, could this unnamed whistleblower be telling the truth? Yeah, I find it very plausible. Whether anything will come of it is a different story. So it's kind of hard to get that fired up about it. It feels like, to me, the right of center equivalent of the walls are closing in. This idea that we're about to have some grand revelation that will expose some terrible scandal and tie up all the Democrats and stuff like that. If it shakes out, terrific, but I feel like we've been down this path or led down this path quite a few times before.
Charles?
We do not have in our constitutional order an exception to the First Amendment or to any other individual rights, or for that matter, to our separation of powers in such cases as a federal agency believes that there might be a vague threat. And I think with this case, we're getting too close to acting otherwise. And essentially what the FBI said, was not, you have to remove this, but was, who will rid me of this turbulent post? And Facebook jumped. Marco Rubio has a bill that's got nowhere, of course, that would mandate disclosure. If any government entity requests a social media site to qualify or remove a user's post, it doesn't prevent Twitter, Facebook, or any other social media site from acquiescing, but it does mandate disclosure if the request is made. Now, there is an exception within Rubio's draft for sensitive information. I think that has to be narrow if this ever makes it into law. I think this has to be more equivalent to an ongoing manhunt or a stakeout. The police could contact Facebook and say, please don't allow posts saying you've noticed 19 SWAT team members on the corner of 3rd and Arizona. Not if the FBI shouts the magic words, national security, vague threat, unsubstantiated problem, that it can get away with it. I want to know when this is happening. I want to know if Jen Psaki or her replacements are contacting Facebook. I want to know if Ron Klain is putting pressure on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram to remove accounts it dislikes. And I want to know if the Federal Bureau of Investigation is insinuating its way into suppressing stories. This is classic. This is why we have protections in place. This is why we either are or should be skeptical whenever those incantations come out. because it is a breathtaking tool, national security. I mean, we just talked about Trump and Mar-a-Lago. Maybe it's the case that in Trump's safe, there are documents that pertain to nuclear weapons in a way that genuinely makes Americans less safe. And if so, let's prosecute Trump and get them back. But the people who put out that statement knew what they were doing, because it's a Trump card, no pun intended. You make your case, you argue, but no, if it's national security, if it's foreign misinformation, if it's interference, I think this is out of control. I think the FBI is out of control. I think the federal government's willingness to interfere is out of control. I think the federal government has got far too accustomed to pretending that matters of quotidian politics, or frankly, partisan self-interest, are inextricable from either the integrity of the homeland or our democracy, so-called. And I would like to see it stop. And I would love to see some form of Marco Rubio's bill become law and raise the cost of the federal government leaning on social media as it does. I've just finished a documentary about the Vietnam War, and that era was famous for the prominence and power and unwillingness to compromise of newspapers. We had the Pentagon Papers. We had all of the major First Amendment cases dealing with libel, dealing with preemption, dealing with prior restraint from that era. And a certain sort of civil libertarian, myself included, likes that. I like that era. I like the New York Times and the Washington Post saying, no, Lyndon Johnson, no, Richard Nixon. We're not doing what you say, and we don't wish to be bullied or cajoled. There's no big difference in principle between those newspapers and social media. And the fact that Mark Zuckerberg sat there and told this story as nonchalantly as he did, the fact that Jack Dorsey sort of casually now says, yeah, I think we got that one wrong, it's not good enough. We need a shift in this area and a little more, perhaps, of the spirit of 71 in our deliberations.
Jim Garrity, I ask a question to you. Assuming in 2024, there's unified Republican control in Washington and healthy margins in Congress, will the FBI continue to exist as it does now? Yes or no?
You'd see nibbling around the edges, reforms. I think when there's a different leader, the next Republican president, will get to appoint an FBI director. They'll be convinced the new guy is going to clean house, and that may or may not be the case.
Sam?
I think it'll stay the same, unfortunately. It seems like, the problem goes pretty deep and is very entrenched and would be hard to actually fix. And the motivation for doing so is weak at best for most politicians.
Troy Cook?
I think the motivation is increasingly strong. And I think that had we had a president last time around who had the instincts that Trump has, but was not lazy and incompetent and subject to flattery, we would have seen more reform in this area. It will, if it happens, be met with the most extraordinary caterwauling and the pretense that reforming the FBI is somehow fascist. But it needs to be done. And I think if we get the right person in 2024 and that person wins, I think there will be some real reforms, not just to the FBI, but to the bureaucracy in general.
So I agree with Charlie that the motivation here is going to be strong and is growing, but really doing something to reorganize or change in a fundamental way the FBI would be such a heavy lift, and there'd be so much political resistance. I got to say, no, I don't think it would happen. So with that, Let me do a quick plug for NR Plus digital subscription service at nationalreview.com. Your way to support our valuable journalism. We really need people to pay for the stuff we do, folks. And if you value it, especially if you value it enough to try to defeat our meter paywall by using different devices and different browsers and who knows what else, what other forms of subterfuge, please stop and just pay up. You'll feel better. It'll be easier for you. It'll be better for us. It'll be a win-win-win all around. Great first-time deals we have running at any given moment. Once you sign up, the paywall goes away. You can comment on blog posts if you want and articles. You see almost no ads. So it's a much better experience and supports our valuable journalism. So please, if you haven't already, join tens of thousands of your fellow National Review readers and sign up for NR Plus. Come on, people, get with the program. So, Jim Garrity, speaking of programs, you watched Trainwreck, Woodstock, 1999.
Yes, this is a documentary on Netflix. It could have been a really long movie, but they just break it into 3 parts, about 40 minutes each. I have only the vaguest of memories. This is not about Woodstock 1969. This is about the effort to do a kind of sequel concert series festival in Rome, New York in 1999. If you do remember it, I was, in my 20s in Washington then. I have just the vaguest memory that something had gone wrong. Oh, no, dear listeners. Everything went wrong. And by the end of it, the area where the concert was being held, honest to God, gets compared to looking like the site of war crimes in Bosnia. Just about everything that could go wrong did go wrong. It's an exceptional exercise in bad planning, lack of foresight, dumb decisions, whistling past the graveyard and ignoring problems until they're completely out of control. In short, it makes the Fire Festival look like the D-Day landings at Normandy. Check it out because it is absolutely fascinating to watch something go so wrong so quickly. Plus, it's just a time capsule of the year 1999 and what was popular then.
It's a great year, 1999. The late 90s were a great time. So, Zan, you saw a Twins game.
I'm actually about to. So tonight I will see.
Oh, about to. Sorry.
Yeah. The Twins are playing the Red Sox. I happen to be in Minneapolis, so I'm going to get to see them tonight. It's great weather here, certainly much better than DC, which is muggy swamp town at the moment, as Jim well knows. And I'm hoping to get to all the MLB parks before my dying day. I have not made much progress, but this will be a good one.
You make yourself sound as if you're 70.
I
Before
hopefully
my dying day, I was like 19.
Sometime. It might eat into your Advent preparations. Well, maybe not. It's seasonal. You can do both, Dan. You can do
How
both.
many ballparks are there? 25?
A lot of travel. When are you ever going to be in Minneapolis? I mean,
Well, you seem to get to all the bergs.
So it looks like a real nice park. I've not been to that one. I was to went to the Metrodome, I think a couple of years before it blinked out of existence. And, a terrible place to watch a baseball game in the abstract, but I kind of like those domes. I wish I'd made it to more. In fact, I don't think I made it to any. I didn't go to the Kingdome. I never went to the Astrodome. What a travesty that is. But the thing I remember from the Metrodome was one kind of I think they still had the plastic baggie up in right field, but just these bizarre right field where these stacked up football seats were during the baseball games and just getting blown out. There's something about the way the air pressure worked, that when you're walking out the door, you literally get like blown out. This gust of wind would push you out the door. But hope you enjoy the game tonight. Charlie Cook, you have been watching the Ken Burns Vietnam.
Yeah, I think maybe this one rivals Jim's documentary for depressing. Right from the beginning, this documentary is depressing. And right from the beginning, and of course they lead you there, but I don't think unfairly so, you're shouting at the television saying, don't do it, don't do it. I recently watched all of Ken Burns' Civil War documentary. That I think is probably the all-time classic, but this is excellent as well. It's detailed, has a lot of primary sources which are useful if, like me, you haven't read a great deal about Vietnam, and really does bring home the futility, both on a micro level. You see Marines and Army units taking the same hill over and over again for no obvious reason. And on the macro level, in that there didn't seem to be a long-term plan. And of course, the minute that public pressure got too much, correctly so, and the federal government responded, the entire enterprise started to look pointless because the North Vietnamese flooded into the South and won the victory that they would have won a lot earlier. So I would recommend this documentary, but it may be the single most depressing television program I've ever seen.
So I have an update about the 40-pound bags of salt in my garage. Talked about this last week, and I don't want to portray myself as a master or expert husband. I don't think actually really any such thing exists, but I have yet another lesson to impart. So I finally got these bags all the way down into the basement. And this is the other key thing. If you're a husband and you want credit, do not claim credit. Do not point to the household task you did. Don't even do it obliquely or indirectly. You got to let it go. You got to let it ride. You got to let it come to you. So I didn't even say anything like, oh, honey, did you notice something in the garage, something different? No. I just let it go. And for days and days and days, it went unmentioned. I had actually basically given up on getting credit. I was chalking it up to, look, I've prevented myself from getting hit on something bad by taking all these 40-pound bags down into the basement. And then it came. I think it was yesterday. It's like, Rich, what happened to the bags in the garage? And I was like, I took them down. No big deal. She's like, really? I thought it was like the guys here to maintain the boiler who took them down. I was like, no, I did it. Really? Wow, that's amazing. How many trips did it take? 50 trips. No, it's no big deal. So it ended up working out perfectly. But can't be too eager. You got to let it. Sometimes, guys, you have to let it come to you. So it's that time in the podcast for our editor's picks. Jim Garrity, what's your pick?
Rich, it is a special edition because I am selecting, quote, Republicans Can't Run and Hide on Abortion by Rich Lowry, just posted this morning. We talked about this a bit earlier in the program, but you just feel like you're banging your head against the wall with some of these lawmakers. Of course, you got to lay out your views. Of course, you got to passionately defend them. It's just a straight up, this is what you should do column. And sometimes apparently Republican politicians need to hear it. And I hope they all read it. Rich.
Jim, I'm beginning to suspect that you only pick me when you don't have anything else. And you're looking at the website desperately at the homepage right before our editor's picks. Please.
Oh, I might as well placate
Rich. Assume that's not true.
It's been a while. All right. How many weeks has it been since I picked a Rich one?
Well, at least he reads your stuff, Rich.
That's a good point.
Zan, what's your pick?
Well, I have to second Jim's encouragement to read your piece today. I think it's really important for Republicans. I hope the Republicans who need to read it will read it. But my pick is Charlie's piece from the most recent issue of the magazine, A Long Goodbye to Trump. I wish we didn't have to talk about him, but we do. And I think Charlie does a good job doing just that.
Charlie Cook, what's your pick?
My pick is by my friend Ellen Carmichael, who has written a piece in NR titled Worried About Student Loan Debt? Start Firing Administrators. Now, of course, this is not a silver bullet. There is a great deal left to reform in higher ed, but this really is a big part of it. The extraordinary number of administrators and middle managers in higher education, many of whom, as Ellen points out, have jobs that are deliberately vague, jobs that you could never justify in a public setting, jobs that if you put a real label on them would be laughed out of the room, but are not, and have led to a extreme bloat that is one of the reasons that college is so expensive. And of course, what Joe Biden has illegally done is not going to help that in any way. If anything, it's going to encourage more of these people because they and the institutions they work for remain unmolested.
So I have a shamefully self-referential pick. It's the little news item we did on Adam Kinzinger attacking me on Meet the Press. I was on the Meet the Press political panel last weekend, and Kinzinger was on a separate segment, and Chuck Todd just asked him something I'd written about how Trump was guilty of a grave political offense and what he did in January 6th, but it would be a stretch to, based on what we know, to indict him, and asked him what he thought of this. And then Kinzinger went off on just what a terrible disappointment I am and how he used to respect me. And he still occasionally reads my stuff, kind of like Jim Garrity. But I used to be an intellectual, and now I'm an anti-Trumper, and so on. And then I don't want to be immodest here, but then I was thinking, like, a month or so ago, Trump totally blasted me in a Truth Social post. It was largely devoted to attacking Peggy Noonan, and there are others who are attacked as well. But I was thinking, what's the diagram here of people who can be attacked these days, both by Adam Kinzinger and Donald Trump? And I was like, is it Kim Jong-un? No, Trump wouldn't attack him. Vladimir Putin? No, Trump wouldn't attack him. Joe Biden? Maybe. I don't know how much Kinzinger attacks him these days. So that's probably, people who fall in that category are very, very few and far between, and very likely to be employed by this publication. So that's it for us. You've been listening to a National Review podcast. Any rebroadcast, retransmission, or recount this game without the express written permission of National Review Magazine is strictly prohibited. This podcast has been produced by the incomparable Sarah Schutte, who makes it sound better than we deserve. Thank you, Charlie. Thank you, Zan. Thank you, Jim. Thanks to the American Federation for Children, and of course, the Mad Dogs and Englishmen Bar and Grill in Tampa, Florida. We hope anyone in the area will check it out in an act of solidarity, if nothing else. And thanks especially to all of you for listening. We're the editors. We'll see you next time.